listening to Drawing the Ideal Self podcast, episode 54. In today's episode, I thought we could look at using a timeline to explore somebody's problems in more detail. It's a very simple and easy thing to use, and you don't need any special equipment. I would always draw things out on a piece of paper, but you can do it just in your head and try and remember the information or jot down notes. I find it helpful to have it on a line on a piece of paper so that I can refer back to it and add more detail. What you're getting there is a picture of the development of a problem. So first of all, let's go back to what Kelly said about when we're trying to help somebody to tell us why they've come for help. So he has 7 basic questions that we would want to know the answers to. And these are questions for the client. Basically, rephrased into more modern language, they are these. Firstly, why have you come for some help? What would you like help with? Secondly, when did you first notice this problem? Thirdly, what were the conditions under which the problem first came into being? Fourthly, what have you tried to do to address the problem? Fifthly, what changes have occurred with the passage of time? So has it stayed the same? Has it become different? And then 6 and 7 are, when do you notice the problem most? And in what situations does the problem not seem to be there? And then 7thly, under what situation is the problem least noticeable? Now, if you use those 7 questions in a conversation with somebody about a problem, you're going to get an awful lot of information just from asking those. And what Kelly said about that was the object of this line of initial questioning is to get a statement of the problem in terms which, as much as possible, reflect a picture of the problem in a fluid rather than in a static condition. He says that the terms in which a problem is defined, rather than the problem itself, frequently determine whether or not it can be solved. So using a timeline in your work is going to be very important. I would always do that. I don't think I've ever seen somebody for many years where I haven't found it absolutely crucial to understanding what's going on with a problem. And if you've ever had a look at Drawing the Ideal Self, that has a timeline built into the process. And the reason for that is that there are 2 things about the timeline that I think are really important. The first one is that by asking people to put things in some kind of order across time, you get an idea of the significant events that they've picked out. We can help them to find particular ones. So if I'm working with children, I would often have timelines that are to do with school, so school years or holiday time, or it could be the start of exams or something like that. So key points. If I'm working with adults, it's going to span a lot longer and can be all kinds of things. But we all build our construing over time. So the way we construe ourselves early in life will change, and we will reconstrue as we meet new experiences. We don't only reconstrue the experiences, we reconstrue ourselves. So something that happened when you're very young is able to be reconstrued at any point. An example of that for me is when I was a kid, I hit someone around the head with a tennis racket. And for many years, until relatively recently really, my focus on that had been, how on earth could I do that? What a terrible thing, and how did I manage to behave like that? I'm not normally an aggressive, violent person, but I did do it. Actually, the circumstances were absolutely relevant to that. So somebody was bullying my friends and myself and stopping us from playing tennis at school against a wall. We're just hitting the ball against a wall, taking turns. And they wouldn't let us play. I think they were maybe older than us, I don't know about that. And we were trying to stand up to them. And that's how I came to hit the person, because they kept getting in the way and I hit the racket and it smacked them around the head. All the attention was focused on, that I had done that to attack somebody, in my head at least. Actually, what I was doing when I thought about it many years later was remembering the circumstance around it and why I had a tennis racket in my hand, how come I was swinging it, and what was going on there. It was more about, I'm going to carry on here, don't stand in my way. Sometimes reconstruing can happen much, much, much later after an event. So just bear that in mind. And you might want to think back in your own life at things that happened early on and your usual construction of them. And then perhaps look a bit wider and remember not just how you construed yourself, but what was actually going on in that situation. And maybe what the options were and how you came to behave in a particular way. And of course, your options are related to your core construing. So you will behave in ways that are consistent with your construing. So for me, it was about not wanting to be bullied and not wanting my friends to be bullied, and also feeling a degree of protection for them and wanting to stop the bullying from happening and show that we weren't going to be a pushover at that school. I think we were probably in the first year of secondary school. So what would you explore using a timeline? Well, you can really explore the development of construing of anything. But really we're interested in the construing of self in particular. So if somebody has come for help because they say, I'm constantly worried, I always think of what's going to go wrong and I am really anxious all the time, that gives us something to explore. So what I would want to do is to say, okay, let's have a look at how that's panned out over time and be genuinely curious to see how that's gone. And then say, okay, you said you've always been worried? Has that been right from the minute you were born? Or would you say that began at a point in your life in particular? And they might say, well, I know I was always worried from when I went to school because people told me that. I didn't know what it was called before, and maybe I could have understood it if somebody had said. But when I first went to school, I was very nervous of it and I would cry every single day. And my mum has told me that when I turned up at school, the teachers had to help me to settle into the class. So I know I was worried from at least the age of 5, starting school. Was I worried before? I'm not really sure. So you might have a conversation like this kind of thing, where you're getting people to be curious about themselves and to think about what was the start point of that problem and what was going on around it. So in that example, the person could identify that school was an issue. They could identify maybe that being somewhere different and very new and very big for a child was a significant event. But let's see what else they might have to say as they go through their life. So I would also ask them, okay, so if this started at least from when you were at school, let's think about how that worked, say, by the end of school. Were you aware at 16, 17 that you were worried all the time? And they say, yeah, I knew that I was a worrier by then very, very clearly. And let's think about what sort of events happened during your school life then that led to the awareness of yourself as somebody who was always worried. And you notice that in that kind of phrasing, you're not saying, no, you're wrong, you can't possibly have been. Although I might think that's true. I'm not saying there must have been circumstances where you weren't worried. Why have you paid attention to only the times when you were worried? They've come for help with the worrying because they've identified themselves as a worrier. I'm not going to dispute that at all. That's how they see themselves, and they know better than I do how their construing system works. My job is to try and work out what's going on, how those constructions have developed, and how they might be shifted a little in order to allow the person to go and get on with their lives in a more comfortable way. And often when people are saying something like, I've always been a worrier, they're not paying attention to these exceptions that Kelly drew attention to. That there'll be times that they weren't worried, or situations in which they weren't worried. And those are very interesting to us. So we might, on a timeline, say, can you think of anything that happened that was an important thing in your life, but you weren't worried in that situation? And they might say, well, I wasn't worried at home because, there was only me and my brother and everything was okay there. I didn't really have anything in particular to be worried about. It was more outside the house. So I might ask, so did you have grandparents? Did you visit them? And they say, yeah, I did. And one of them, I was a bit worried at their house. The other one, I was absolutely fine. Now, that's interesting. So I would be asking, okay, so how old were you, do you think, when you noticed that your worrying was there when you went to one grandparent's house? And they might say, well, when I was 7, I went there and it was a very difficult day because my grandma had been really ill. The ambulance had to come and take her and Grandad was really upset. So you're getting some context for that about what it could have been associated with. So the worry at that house, was that to do with, okay, things are not predictable enough here. I don't know what's going to happen. And I would want to ask about, okay, so you're about 7 then. Did you always worry at your grandparents' house after that? Can you remember that feeling? And they say, yeah, there was just something about that house, which I guess was connected with the event. So already we're getting a connection being made that maybe hadn't been noticed before. So rather than I've always been a worrier, it's now I was a worrier in some situations and in other situations I was okay. So I'd want to know more about those as well. So I might ask, when you went to your other grandparents' house and you weren't worried, what do you think that was about? And they say, well, it was my mum's mum and she and my mum were really alike. They liked the same things. The environment was quite similar to my house, really. And also, that set of grandparents always did a lot of things with us that were enjoyable to me. They took me to places I liked rather than places they thought would be a good idea for us to go. My other grandparents maybe took me to places that would be good for me, but, that wasn't always very interesting and sometimes I didn't like it. So we're getting more and more information about why somebody might be more anxious in one situation than another. And if you remember the definition of anxiety in PCP, it's about not having the constructs you need to understand a situation and anticipate how it's going to go. So if that set of grandparents took them to events that they didn't understand, so I don't know, maybe they took them to a highly intellectual part of the Science Museum and expected them to be able to get everything. I don't know. If I think of that, it might be something to do with atoms or something that it's very difficult to construe because they're very abstract. But if that person then takes on board that they're going to be in situations with their grandparents that make them anxious, the anxiousness is about not being able to construe. The other set of grandparents had similar interests to the parents, similar interests to them, and therefore their anticipation of experiences was a lot more comfortable. So in this timeline of becoming somebody who is always worried, at the very beginning, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I would want to know what the contrast was. So if they say, well, somebody is never worried, that's at one end of the scale. Their being a worrier all the time is at the other end of the scale. So when we're looking at their timeline, I have got some idea of how that is construed. So their contrast of not worrying it's probably not that realistic for life. There'll always be periods of time in life that we are worried. So trying to aim to have no worry in your life probably isn't very easy to do. So even from that, I'm thinking, okay, so that construct is very tight. It's not going to be that helpful for situations, and it's probably going to lead to the person getting themselves into situations where they're seeing very familiar things happen, which is, I am worried as opposed to I'm not worried at all. So their contrast is so extreme that actually that's pretty hard to live with. Because if all you're doing is going through life saying, is it this or this? There's no grey in between. There's no other constructs that are a bit more loose. Then it's going to be pretty stressful. It also, though, may be easier. If you think that I'm not going to do things that make me worried, the first thing you do is categorise them as that's a worrying experience or that isn't, and then you dismiss all the ones that are things that don't make you worried. And if you think of somebody, say with agoraphobia, who stopped going out, they stop going out completely. So they stay around their own house, and they might walk to their own shop, but they don't go to town, they don't go out for experiences, because they've decided that it makes more sense to them to do that. They're not avoiding life necessarily, but they're avoiding living with the anxiety of not being able to anticipate events very clearly. And that anxiety for some people becomes very big, and they would prefer to avoid it. They may live their life in their house very comfortably, and they don't feel the need to do more. But actually, when you talk to them about whether there's anything they would want to do, they find it hard to say. So you might have to start with really tiny steps. Something like, would you like to be able to go around to your daughter's house, not just stay in? And they might say, well, yeah, actually, because the other day the baby was ill and I could have gone round to help, but I couldn't go because of my agoraphobia. So we've got something that person might like to change, but it's going to be a small thing because the daughter lives very near them, but it's a start. And the smallest changes at the beginning are sometimes the ones that have the massive effect later on. Just getting change happening is very, very important. And I would be focused more on getting any change than getting no change, however it is. If that means you eat your dinner with a different spoon, that's a change. And sometimes when people are really stuck that they're doing the same thing over and over and over again and feel they can't move, you need to start with teeny tiny changes, because what you're doing there is trying to help somebody to understand that change isn't all bad. It might be okay. Let's experiment with it. Let's not commit to it completely, but let's experiment. And we've had previous podcast episodes about exactly this. So there are a few that you can go back and look at. So going back to the timeline, I would try and pick some significant events. If it's a child, you can do the starting school, before school. You can also ask about, what do you think that was like as a baby? Do you think you were a worrier then? Were you always a worrier? Did you pop out into the world already worried? If you did, do you think you were a worrier actually in the womb as well? Did it start there, or where do you think it began? Those are interesting questions because actually nobody knows the answer to. They're purely constructions. We don't know if a baby is worried in the womb. We don't know if a baby is worried. We know that a baby is crying or not crying, and over time we will try and work out what those things are, and we will also help them to develop language to speak back to us and tell us what's going on in their head. But we don't know. So those are constructions that have been put onto the experience after the event. And obviously in family life you get some of those constructions from other people. People will say, yes, you've always been a worrier. I can remember when, and they give examples. And it doesn't matter what it is about the way you're construed, your family will be telling you, you are like this, or you were like this. Or you used to be like this and now you're really different. The other thing to include on a timeline, as well as places, is people. So those are situations, being with certain people. So being in particular relationships, those are interesting things to put on a timeline. So if you know the person has been in a long-term relationship with a partner, you might say, okay, so when you met your partner, do you think you were worried all the time then? And if you were, how did you meet them? So how does a person who's worried all the time get to meet somebody else? What was the circumstance around that? So tell me about that. And what you're trying to do is look all the time for exceptions. Have them in times when, although they were worried, it was a manageable level of worry, or the worry wasn't present. Another experience which is very significant might be having children. So a question about, so let's think, how old were you when you had your first child? Put that on the timeline. And do you think you were a worrier then? What was that like for you? Were you somebody who was a worried parent? And they might say, well, not really. As a parent, I was okay. I was worried about me, but not to that extent, because I think I was really busy with the baby. Again, we're looking for exceptions. So we're noticing that when this person is living their life, they're not always expecting to be worried after all, even though they've described themselves as always being a worrier and always a worrier. And then you might think of experiences, did you have any great holidays? And put those on the timeline. And, when you were on holiday, were you worried? How did you come, if you were always a worrier, to book a holiday in Vietnam? How did that happen? What was going on then? Did you think that you were going to be worried in Vietnam? And they might say, well, actually, when I'm with my partner, I don't worry half as much. It's more when I'm on my own. So now we've got another exception, that being around certain people is definitely helpful to this person. And I might say, that's really interesting. So even though you're going to another country, you don't know the rules, you don't know how it works, you're willing to take a chance on that without being too worried about worrying. And that's because your partner's going with you. And they might say, yeah, my kids as well, and I can't really show that level of worry in front of them because that's not fair. So then we've got another exception, that there's something going on when they're around their children where the worrying is more manageable, or they feel they have control of it. And the control might be in the showing rather than the worrying, so that the children don't know how worried that person is. So already in this conversation, we can see that the always a worrier, although it's a tight construct, there have been exceptions to it. So what you can do with the timeline is ask these curious questions about, okay, so what was going on there then? So, how does someone who's a real worrier do something like that? That's really interesting, isn't it? Interesting that you could. And you're drawing that person's attention to the exceptions. And this is important because this is about saying to them, the way you're construing yourself isn't only from your experiences, it is also the lens that you're using to view your experiences. So attention is being paid to things that are more worrying. And that's one of the benefits of a timeline, that the person isn't necessarily giving you only their time points. The therapist is asking for time points, and the person may not have paid much attention to that. So that can, when we're trying to hold on to our constructs, we can look back in time and pick out certain things that, definitely contributed to the development of a problem. But noticing the exceptions is more tricky. So it's helpful if the therapist can draw attention to those. And remember that what Kelly was saying is we want to see this problem as fluid. And fluid means that it changes according to what's around it. So in some circumstances it's more obvious, in some it's less. It may go away completely in others. And that's really interesting. Because if it does go away completely in others, why is the person paying attention to the worrying rather than the other things? Partly that's a shorthand, that we all construe things as quickly as we possibly can, and we will have developed a picture of ourselves over time. We will also have been given one by our families. We'll have an identity that's related to that. And of course, as we get older, we have various roles that we play, and we'll have identities that are related to those roles. So the kind of parent you are, the kind of worker you are, all of those things. But this kind of idea of construing yourself as a worrier will be present in all of those. So this idea that this person has of being a worrier, we want to know about how does it play out in all of these situations that you go into. When you're doing the washing up, are you a worrier then? When you're hoovering, are you a worrier? When you're out in your garden or when you're walking your dog? All of those things. And I think often with something like worrying, the person hasn't realised that actually they've been able to at least put the worrying aside in order to make decisions that are entering new experiences, such as deciding to have a baby, or getting a dog, or moving house, or applying for a job. So there are many things in life which are about change, but the person isn't necessarily paying attention to those. So the benefit of a timeline is to be able to draw their attention to experiences, get them to think about how they've described themselves and those experiences together. So how were they in those situations? If they described themselves as always a worrier, was it worrier to the same extent every time? Could they give a rating of that worry out of 10? Could they say, well, actually, when I chose my dog, I knew it was going to be a change in the family, but that was a good thing. I wasn't really worried about that. I was right down at 3. The next thing might be, when we moved house, I was right up at 10. That was a really stressful experience. I didn't know how it was going to go. I wasn't certain that we'd going to get the house that we wanted, etc., etc. And obviously, children have a much shorter timeline, but it can be equally rich. So don't be put off from doing this, however old the child is. A 5-year-old has construed themselves for 5 years. That's a pretty long time. They've developed a sense of self. They've got an idea of who they are. Okay, it's rudimentary at that age compared with somebody who's 50, but it's still there, that they've got a sense of who they are and how they respond to the world. And they've also got a strong sense of other people. So over time, a 5-year-old will have been able to construe themselves, and as they get older they will look back on more experiences and reconstrue. They can't avoid that. So I did some work with a little girl who told me that she had always been angry, and she drew a timeline and she placed herself on it in various points with little drawings, and one was of her as a baby being an angry baby, and then her as a toddler being a really angry toddler, and then her on the way to school kicking the lamppost. She didn't have any problem doing that because at 8 she had a strong sense of herself as always having been angry. So I would highly recommend using a timeline. I can't think of a circumstance where I wouldn't do one in some way or another. So it might be a timeline of the development of a sense of self, as in drawing the ideal self. It might be a timeline in the development of a problem, as in the anxiety example I've given, but it's always going to be useful. And what you're going to find out is lots and lots of constructs. You'll hear the person saying all kinds of things that are going to be useful and interesting to you. I would recommend that you do the timeline and then have the detailed discussion about it, rather than the other way round. And the reason for that is it's interesting to have a sense of a development of a problem or a development of a person, and then go back to certain things, because by getting the whole picture first, and obviously it's not the total picture, more things can be added at any point, because we remember things as we're having these conversations, and people will say, oh yeah, and there was that as well, and you might say, okay, so where would that go on this timeline then? How old were you at the time? And what were you doing at the time? Sometimes people can't remember an age, but they remember a circumstance. I was at primary school, for instance. But what you've got there is a source of construing. If you go into too much detail as you're making it, you might never finish it. So I would recommend that you do that. And then you can go back and think, okay, are there constructions of the self here that there's a contrast to? Is the person aware of the contrast, or is it submerged? And we've talked about that before. Are they thinking about how easy is it for them to give the contrast to the various constructions that have come up? If it's easy, that's interesting, because it's a rehearsed, experienced construing that's been turned into words already. If they find it hard to explain, that might be because it's a construct that's pre-verbal, non-verbal, and something they just haven't yet turned into words to tell somebody else. Doesn't mean they're not doing the construing though, remember that. And I would refer you back to the episodes on non-verbal and pre-verbal construing. Okay, so what could you do with that? It's the school holidays, people will be lying on the beach, all that kind of stuff. If you take a notebook with you, what you could do is have a go at doing it for yourself. Think of a key way that you might describe yourself, and do a timeline and look at the development of that construct over time. So if you said, I am somebody who's always active, you might say, okay, so let's have a look at myself and the development of that construct. When did I first know I was always active? Was somebody telling me that? Is there a teacher who described me like that? Is it my parents? Where did it come from? How did I learn that? And look at your own timeline. It's quite a good idea when you're using any PCP techniques, first of all, to have a go with it on yourself, so that you get an idea of the flow, and to me is the validity. Does it do what you think it's going to do? Does it turn up some interesting constructs? So by having a go with yourself, you're going to find that out. And then it gives you a bit more faith that when you're using it with another person, that actually this is a valid, useful part of the work. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. If you're on a summer holiday in the UK, I hope it's sunny. Who knows? Might be. It has been, but now, of course, everyone's on school holidays. It might not be. That's how it works here. So enjoy yourself, and I will see you again at the end of August.